let's say we get to a good sense-making ecology, as Daniel did such a great job laying out in the first half of this conversation. And he was predominantly focusing on the systems and the structures, literally the kind of, the sort of, exterior quadrants, right, of system, society, technology, and talked a little bit about the interior of an individual, making sense of that polluted information ecology. And are people holding things back? Are we sharing clearly? Is there a difference between truth and truthfulness of signal? All those kinds of important points. And then we're all getting to yes, 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 yes. Now the next crux is, how do we do collective, coherent sense-making together? How do we drop into what Victor Turner, the anthropologist, called communitas, right? You could also, Keith Sawyer at the University of North Carolina, described it as group flow. And I think that I think they're pretty damn near analogous, right? It's basically the idea of what happens when we all get together and something more than what us each could have come up with individually emerges from that thing, right? And so there's a lot of wondering and there's a lot of theorizing. There's not a lot of demonstrable practice yet. And even Otto Scharmer, who's a friend and colleague of ours, he's at MIT, he popularized Theory U, which is all about co-creative emergence. There are world cafes, there are varying other modalities around this. Most of them are all about just fucking talking better with each other, which I don't find super compelling. I think that's pretty weak sauce when it comes to overriding all of evolutionary biology, the prison house of language, and game theory dynamics. I just don't think they're really adequate. They're aspirational, and you get a bunch of tightly self-selected people in a group like that, and they can sometimes, with a lot of time and effort, and often with not a lot of practical outcomes. So my sense is if you look at it and you look to see, well, where do people get into communitas, high-performing communitas, true group flow on a regular basis? They are almost always violently meritocratic organizations. So if you take special operations military, they brutally select for who gets in, they massively overtrain for what they're going to do, and if you can't, there's a shared knowledge and a felt sense by the masters in the group of the thing we're trying to get to. What does it feel like when we drop? What does it feel like when egos dissolve and we create a high-functioning hive mind? So there are people that are anchoring it, and then as you bring in new people to that, it's a pretty brutal test of, can you get there with us? Can you contribute to that thing or not? And so it's sort of up or out. And we will swap you with the next person in line for someone that can. If you think of Miles Davis's jazz bands, right? I mean, he was a genius musician and was utterly ruthless on who could hang in his band, right? If you couldn't swing, if you couldn't hit the chord changes, if you couldn't play at that level, you would be swapped for someone who could, right? And the same with the Golden State Warriors or the Lakers or any of the European Football League, right? I mean, you look at Real Madrid, you look at any of these teams, and you would make that case as well. They are ruthlessly meritocratic, right? And you have to have the skill set to do the thing. Alternately, so let's say, alternately, you've got a lot of egalitarian communities of practice, gatherings, etc., particularly in the kind of the progressive space. Extinction Rebellion would be an example among thousands, where the value set is very different. They're saying, hey, we are trying to get to this co-creative emergence via consensus, via inclusion, and it's very difficult. So just to acknowledge that so far, this thing, this ineffable drop into communitas or into high-level coherence is rare and tricky. So first, can we just acknowledge that? Right? If it were easy, we'd already all be doing it. Secondly, is that the majority of the exemplars we have of it are tightly controlled, highly focused, and quite exceptional. When we then just pivot over without necessarily noticing we've done so, and we end up in a community of practice with a different set of values, which are generally skewed towards inclusivity, everyone having a voice, those are noble ideals. They just might be antithetical to what we've known to date about how to get into those states. And in that light from light, shadow from shadow experience that we were describing earlier, I think that's kind of what happens. So you might find a lot of people that are paying lip service to shared espoused ideals. We get together, we say, we're going to try and do this thing. And whether that's the early stages of Game B, 5-10 years ago, right? Or whether it's any of the movements right now on, future-proofing the world. You get a large group of people together, they all think they're on a shared mission, you start getting the error messages, you start seeing shadow from shadow, you start increasing doubt and decreasing trust, and what do people do? They typically just shrink their sphere of concern. They create break-offs, right? And actually Daniel, I think, mentions that in some of his other descriptions of group information ecology. You create factions and defections, right? Splintering, withholding of information, and basically intuitively, while it feels shitty and it feels like backstabby tribal politics quite often, as we live through those things, it's actually a rational movement, which is, oh shit, if we can't get there with all of us, because we can't trust all of us to know how, right, and to play well, then the very natural thing for me to do is shrink my sphere to the people I do still have trust with and do think we can cohere with, until you get smaller and smaller. But obviously that's antithetical to any of our hopes and sense of urgency about scaling this thing. So step one is just to identify, are we, right, valuing exclusivity, right, whatever it takes to get the high, hard goal done, or do we privilege inclusivity, right? And then in the polarities mapping model, there's basically saying, identify the upsides of what can happen if we do get it right, but also identify the downsides. What happens if we over-index to this pole and we start seeing the negatives? Right? So for exclusivity, right, it would be that it's a small, agile group of people, they're deeply skilled, there's very little clutter or distraction, and we actually get there. We get to coherence, and we get to coherence in a high trust, low friction framework. Fantastic. But the downside of exclusivity is you leave a lot of people on the sidelines, right? It can create resentment, it can create blowback, very difficult to scale, and often ends up being sort of tops-down dissemination, right? Which is, potentially, overtly hierarchic or exclusive. Got it, right? Well, let's take a look at what happens. What are the good things of inclusivity? Everybody has a seat at the table. There's a diversity of voices. There's an inclusion of former outgroups, right? There's a heterodox nature to our meaning making and sense making together, right? And there's a sense of this actually just, more closely matches our humanitarian values in the first place. What are the downsides? Well, we're all acutely aware of the downsides of, pathological inclusion, which is that any singular voice can hijack the thread. It's very difficult. It's sort of like a hippie drum circle, versus a master djembe player, right? You just get noodly mud. Things take an awfully long time, quite often, to get to consensus. Consensus is fragile and can be firebombed by anybody playing an SJW card or any other kind of agitator, victim, drama triangle kind of dynamics. And because we value inclusivity, we are obligated to stop the presses when anyone says, help, help, I'm being oppressed, right? And so the ability to weaponize cult of sensitivity, nonviolent communication, and all those things is abundant. And when you have narcissists or sociopaths or just, chatty Cathys and needy Neds infiltrate those scenes, and they often do, then it never gets off the ground. So the question is, how do we steer between those? And I think that's, and so a couple of examples of that. My sense is obviously, is there a both and? Is there a way that we can acknowledge this is hard, it's subtle and nuanced, and it actually requires a surprising amount of skill and facility, and even the ability to drop ego. Right, Gavin? I think, as you've explored the difference between the IDW, the intellectual dark web, and what were the tenor and flavors of some of those conversations versus more of these kind of emerging conversations, I would sense, one of them is rational, separate egos slinging right thoughts constructs at each other versus people looking and listening to play jazz. Right? And so you can make a kid, there's almost that watershed moment. So how might we have the best of both of these things? High and hard are rare for now, and we're going to need a vanguard. And on the other hand, all of us or none of us, it's really critical that we find ways to help this propagate.